House of Card is, of course, a pun on the TV series. But House of Card is also the idea that you build a house of paper and you have a look how far you can push it. This show is a combination of works which start with a model out of paper, very often in a small scale, done by different people, different artists, different architects, by me, by the artist, and go through the iterations of that, what a model can represent, to a full-scale building which is under construction in a different part of Europe right now. It's a very full-on three-dimensional experience. It's not a photo show, and it tries to combine different media with each other, like film, found objects, mock-ups, big buildings, reconstructions, to a hopefully relatively interesting and exciting exhibition. Don't really know what the relation to sculpture is. It's kind of a mixed bag. I started making sculptures which I don't have to store to start with. So you don't have any objects which you need to take care of when you were a student. And that departure led me to document my sculptures. However, the sculptures all have a narrative, a really strong narrative. First of all, the spaces, the rooms, the interiors, and many of them have some kind of significance which is out of the picture, which is the context in which we learned about that space. So the first room, for instance, has Embassy. And Embassy is a work which consists on 10 images of an embassy of the Republic of Niger in Rome, in which somebody broke in. And out of that whole little unknown incident got the main evidence for Saddam Hussein having a nuclear bomb called Yellow Cake Scandal. And it became a huge world-changing event. However, nobody ever entered that beginning, so to say, the source of the whole scandal, which is the embassy itself, which is a small nondescript apartment in Rome. And so I tried to gain access, which I did eventually, and rebuild the entire set in one-to-one. However, I don't need the set afterwards anymore. And the picture itself, the series of pictures, show you something which you couldn't see anywhere else. So it became an idea, and then became a sculpture, and then it became a series of photographs. So in the end, the sculpture itself went away. So I made these sculptures, like in the beginning it was a very simple daily object, and it was two objects. Suddenly you have a narrative. Narrative becomes dominant, so you have to control the narrative of these objects to each other. Imagine you have a desk, there's a pen, there's an ashtray, and let's say there's a torch. So why is a torch on a desk? And suddenly, as a viewer, you make a story out of that. With model studies, I started to look at the models of other people instead of my own models. And I started with John Lautner's models. He's famous for not being a great draftsman, but a very good architect, which makes buildings which are mostly unpredictable in a sense. So the classic modernism, we know, the Mies van der Rohe modernism, when you see a corner, you know what the rest of the building looks like because it's so logical. With John Lautner, if you see one corner and you move the camera a little bit, it's already a different building. And film liked it very much. His fellow architects didn't like it very much at the time. And he was an architect who built around 180 buildings, as far as I know. And the bequest of all his office and everything is in the hands of the Getty Institute, the Getty Research Institute, where I went to be a scholar in 2010. He tended, to, like me, to throw everything away once a project is gone. And so 13 models remain, and these 13 models are all depicting projects which haven't been realized. And I photographed those from a very close-up, in a sense that it becomes an abstract image. I did do a similar second iteration of the series with Model Studies 2, a very boring titling of numbers, numeric numbering, numeric counting down. That's in the office of Sana. I worked with Sana on the Architectural Biennale, and they invited me to come to their office. And I saw an empire of paper, which was really fantastic because they never throw anything away. At least I thought they do. The office has very many languages running around, mostly English and Japanese, which doesn't really kind of, there's no relation between the two, so there's a lot of misunderstanding if it's linguistic, but a very good understanding if it's formal. And so they have these paper objects which they make out of office paper because it's the cheapest and the fastest. And all these kind of copy paper sculptures or models become eventually architecture, or they won't become architecture, but they're always a communicative tool, and they pile them up. So when you walk through their office, there's towers and towers of projects, which is really beautiful. And I started photographing those. After that, I heard about the bequest of Hans Hollein, the archive being split up into pieces, and I had a possibility to go to the original apartment where Hollein worked. In fact, it's 5 apartments over the time, because he filled each of these apartments and then locked them up. And I photographed a couple of models from that, and then I ended up now with the last one so far, which is Model Studies 4, where I dragged the idea of an architectural model, and all those models are never being made to represent an architecture or present the idea to the client. It's always a thinking tool. It's always for themselves. So it's never about shininess, about beauty, about how big and tall people are or anything like that. It's always about like, how do I solve the problem of the form which which my client wants from me. And so the 4th one is Shapes of Dresses by Azedine Alaya, which I knew before he passed away. And this is the archive of all the shapes over like 40 years of practice, which is hanging in a warehouse. And the atelier, which is still existing, every now and then kind of reconstructs, so to say, another practice which I recognize from my own practice, a dress which has been done like in 1992 or something like that. And the archive as it is gets mixed up. The colors of the shapes, which are the cutouts, gets mixed up, and it's very, random, aleatoric, which for a painter is wonderful, because it's kind of suddenly you have a composition, you have the shapes, you have the color range. And so I thought that would be quite interesting as well, the potential of the dress, of the parts of the dresses. So these shapes you use to kind of put them flat on the textile, you mark the outline of those, and then you sew it together. So Alaya is also famous for doing them himself in the first dress. And then some confectioner comes and makes it in different sizes, as we know him. But like the first dress is done by himself, which is a very unusual practice. It used to be like that in the 19th century, but now nobody ever did it anymore like that. And they very beautiful biographical objects. They have a patina, they have the traces of use, a little writing here, a little measure there. And I thought those shapes are really beautiful and very reminiscent of my own shapes. The model studies in general is the idea to go to some kind of abstraction, which I could do in my studio with leftovers of my work, but I think that would be a too close circle. It's a way of looking at model making from a distance. The model making, what is the model? What is the practicability of a model itself? And what is the physical surface of a model once it's not like to be shown in a museum? And these concerns were in the middle of my focus. The collaborations came about like anything else in architecture. You never build a building alone, whereas I do build my own models alone. So the collaboration in the embassy was basically that we wanted to show the series, but we wanted to show it in a way that you experience my walking through that unknown territory. And the architect Arno Brandlhuber, which I collaborated with on this one, basically didn't reconstruct the apartment, he reconstructed the views, the position of the image with the perspective of the image itself, how you would go through that space. The Nagelhaus has been a commission which we were asked to contribute to in Zurich, and we won the competition, we won the commission. We convinced the city to build it, we convinced the county to build it. It seemed to be like a popular project. The whole idea was that we built a Chinese restaurant which kind of just closed in in China because it had to make way for like a development. And the owner of that restaurant refused to go. For 3 years he could do it, then his health could deteriorated and he had to close anyways. But that building became famous, and it just closed like half a year before we started promoting our project. And it's the exact reconstruction of that building, but underneath a bridge in Zurich, which we found quite fitting in terms of globalism. Floating of capital, especially Chinese capital, the idea of a building saying no, a building being a rhetorical, an answer instead of a question. And it was supposed to be a restaurant which runs 24 hours a day. Which is not existing in Zurich. So whenever you get hungry, you can go and eat Chinese food. We ran into political quarrels after passing all the institutional juries and everything, and that was for budget reasons which were out of our reach. We had to kind of budget for a disabled toilet, and the numbers we were given were from a German supplier. But for some reason, it had to be a Swiss supplier, which was like 6 times more expensive than the German one. And we're talking about 70,000 versus 480,000. And the right-wing party, which doesn't have any share in governing, at least it didn't have at the time, because the other parties all make a coalition all the time to keep them out of power. The only way they can have any influence and therefore any attention is by doing plebiscites. And they ran a plebiscite because that budget change wasn't, I don't know, properly processed or needed to be assigned by the citizens of Zurich or something like that. And they started a campaign which was actually very funny and beautiful with a golden toilet. For those of you which kind of are firm in the art history, the toilet has a long story in modern contemporary art. Like if you think of Marcel Duchamp and the pissoir, and so they had on the cover, on the posters, they had a golden toilet, and they kind of basically took the entire budget and said, this is all for a golden toilet, 5.7 Swiss francs or something like that, which was of course misleading, but there it goes. For me, it wasn't that hard that the building didn't get built. We built a mock-up in 1:1, which is also in the exhibition. It was a very interesting process with the architects to go back and forth. So I build a model, I send it to them, they make a plan, I get it back, I build a bigger model, I send it back to them. And we were like trying to a rather unconventional way of developing a building, and the idea that the building always had to be looking like a model once it's in a large scale. So I didn't want to have a Madame Tussauds building, I wanted to have a building which kind of where you really don't know, is this real or is it not? And to translate this in full scale is tricky. And it didn't happen in the end, which is fine with me. I didn't want to go into any political campaigning. The architects tried to do that. But the building itself had some consequences because nothing is there still. People are still standing underneath a highway bridge and have to wait for the bus. There's still no 24-hour restaurant in Zurich. But the term we coined, which is Nagelhaus, which means the house of the nail, is still around in Switzerland. We have a Google alert. Whenever that is used in Switzerland, we get an alert, and like every 2-3 months I get a little alert that somebody else has refused to move out of a house because they didn't want to have a street there instead, or like they didn't want to pass from the house where they're born or something. And they call it a Nagelhaus, which is wasn't a common used word before at all. And we made this word because in China there is a saying, if you withstand the pressure of society, you will be hit like a nail sticking out of the wood. And so that's where we came from, and we can prove that word didn't really exist in Germany before, in German language. And that's a very nice little thing. Like that's a very nice little leftover that even 10 years after that, what we did, instead of building a building, we kind of basically put a word in the vocabulary. There's also a third project, which is a collaboration with architects, same architects, Caruso St John, as the Nagelhaus, and that's a pavilion which I was invited to build in Denmark, in Ebeltoft, which is a small remote town on the coast, next to Aarhus. And the client wanted to have a place where you can get together and sit, discuss, come up with new plans, not be in a corporate environment, because like the company itself sits next to a warehouse, and they wanted to have like something when you make all the way to get to the company from, I don't know, London, America or something, to have something to remember, like a place where you have been, and give it a heart, the whole thing. And that's my first real build commission. It's under construction right now. And that is based on the idea of translating the logic of paper. How do you make paper constructions into real life? We have like 3 shapes, which are all coming from the world of paper, so to say. One is a plate, like a paper plate. That's the roof for the little canteen. There is a sheet of paper which is folded in the middle. That's the roof for the, so to say, like the gathering, the PowerPoint presentation space. And there's a third one, which is basically the shape of a hat, like you find them in McDonald's, like the paper hat which you put on. And that's the kind of combination of the 3 shapes kind of intertwined into each other. You can go from one without getting into the rain to the others. It's being under construction right now, and it's kind of interesting in this case because this time I had a design and I wanted this to be implemented into steel and fiberglass. In a sense, it's also consistent with my other work, which is like the embassy or photographic work, because I don't expect many people to actually go there. So in the end, you will see that building on photographs mostly, instead of actually having it like in Zurich underneath the highway bridge, where it's the material quality is very, very different and very complicated, especially when it's in use 24 hours by 70,000 people waiting, which the Nagelhaus would have been. It's the traffic spot there. I think models are kind of really a completely underexposed cultural technique which we use every day. In art history, you have the famous iconic turn, which is late 70s, where people would kind of actually pick up on the fact that we don't have any grammatic to read an image and understand what images kind of basically can say. We have texts and analytics of texts, of course, linguistics, philosophy, but we don't have the same equal discipline in images. That's a famous, flagpole of art history. But models are a much broader used idea of like reducing the world into a system of signifiers. If you think of the weather forecast, that is a model. If you think of the DNA, of course, that's a model. If you think of the retirement plan, which you might pay in, that's a model because it's based on demographics, which is again a model. If you think of elections are models because they reduce the possibilities of your gains and hopes and dreams of how society should be to parties. And then you have the parties, and the coalition is supposed to represent what all the citizens think, or what the state is thinking, which is of course again like based on a model. Science in general is based on a model. If you think of toys, children's toys, you have these little dogs. Maybe even before the baby sees a real dog, it's playing with a little puffy animal, which is a dog. If you think of school, if you think of like the use of models is everywhere. And what a model does, it reduces the complexity of reality to some key elements which are important for the model. And that can be played with. It doesn't have to be only like bright colors. It doesn't have to be small scale, like that's what people think usually of puppet houses, for instance, of models. It doesn't have to be a replacement material. A model can be exactly the same material as the real thing it depicts. But this kind of level of abstraction of reality, because we would go crazy if we kind of have everything which we experience at some point at the same time. Also, models are very useful for communication. As I said, retirement funds can sell their product because everybody knows that it's based on a model of demographics and how old people are supposed to get. And this vast idea, medicine, you learn medicine on models. You don't learn a medicine and you don't want to make your mistakes on real people until you actually know what you're doing. If you think of the understanding of like how an eye works, like you have this beautiful big model where the scale is bigger than the real thing, where you can see all this. So models are a cultural technique, which I think is there is not enough theoretical consideration about. And for me, they are a beautiful way of rebuilding our impression of the world. In other words, a memory. A memory of a place which we have seen, which we have not seen, but it's an artificial memory. If I say, for instance now, like, do you remember the tunnel where Lady Di had an accident? I'm pretty sure that most of you can somehow describe what it looked like. And I find this amazing because there's an image, and we have an image we can construct this image in our head, we can communicate about this. And if I build a model of that, I'm not rebuilding actually the tunnel, I'm rebuilding the memory of that, all the things necessary to recognize the tunnel as such, for instance. Or Saddam Hussein, where did he hide out? The wall coming down in Germany and people kind of trying to find their files. The bathtub where a famous politician kind of apparently committed suicide, which he didn't. So we have these marking points, and the models I'm building of things, they are kind of depicting what we remember instead of what it really was, and that's basically the core of my work. The show at M is a very different take on my work, on a part of my practice which has not been shown much, or like here and there, or in Japan one in Zurich, but like it's basically combining my relation to architecture. And I think over the years we became quite interesting in terms of collaborative, of like how a show could look like exhibition architecture, and we trying to combine like an idea of like taking space, going out in the reality, with something which is actually not really fit for that, which is the paper model. We'll be presenting the pavilion in Ebeltoft in Denmark for the first time. The model studies 4 will be shown for the first time. Azzedine Alaia, nobody has seen those photographs. We will show for the first time Rirkrit Tiravanija's project, which is based on a work I did, which is based on a bar in Japan, which I found when I was there. That has never been shown together. We're showing the Nagelhaus model, which is was only a mock-up for the Venice Biennale to study the surface material. We're showing that one again since after 15 years. So we combining things also, like an artwork by Martin Boyce, which I showed in another Venice Biennale, Architecture Biennale, with my model studies 1, which kind of enriches and opens up possibilities and inspiration, hopefully, to the viewer to kind of think beyond the artwork as a square on a wall.